In late 1980, Iraqi troops faced a stalemate in the war against Iran, with the Iraqi forces failing to take control of Kermanshah, Dezful, Awaz, and Abadan. The Iraqi authorities attempted an overture to Iran, but the Iranian government continued to demand the departure of Saddam Hussein, the fall of the regime, recognition of Iraq's full responsibility for the war, and payment of significant war reparations. The Ayatollah Khomeini declared Khorramshahr a martyred city, urging the government to prioritize the families of fallen heroes. This led to the creation of the Martyrs Foundation, which assisted the families of Revolutionary Guards killed on the front. The Supreme Defense Council was established to control the armed forces' actions and reinforce the Pasdaran's power. Saddam Hussein intensified bombing of cities like Khuzestan to punish the Iranian people and force Tehran to negotiate. The Iraqi regime fired a salvo of 7 frog missiles on Dezful, but it had the opposite effect. The Iraqi military command launched a new offensive on Khuzestan, but was met with deadly barrage fire from the Iranian 16th Armored Division. The Iraqi forces also failed to reduce the Syrian salient, as they were systematically repelled by the Pasdaran. The Iranian helicopters brought reinforcements to Susangurd, but the Iraqis stopped attacking and fell back on their artillery. This led to the arrest of some officers and execution, as an example. In Abadan, the city's defenses did not crumble at the sight of the Iraqi combatants or the roar of their guns. The Iraqi command did nothing to fully encircle Abadan, and the lack of initiative handicapped the Iraqi camp. Iranian pilots took advantage of the battle in Khuzestan to impose their supremacy, shooting down around 40 Iraqi firefighters and destroying 12 planes. The Tomcat pilots emerged victorious, taking down 23 enemy planes without sustaining any losses. This impressive score was due to the sophistication of the Tomcat's weapons system, the skill of pilots used to whirling air combat and evasive actions, and the motivation of crews burning to prove their worth. Despite being severely damaged during these engagements, all were able to get back to base. Squadron leader Abbas Hazim became a popular hero, and Captain Mohammed Maslow used a single Phoenix missile to bring down 3 MiG-23s over Karg Island. The Tiger pilots were not to be outdone, but they were able to destroy a MiG-23 without using a single projectile. The Iraqis exhibited the wreckage of Iranian fighter planes along the paths of Al-Zawra Park in Baghdad, and the Iranians followed suit by lining up the remains of Iraqi aircraft in the squares of their major cities. In late December, after 3 months of nearly daily air combat, the score was 60 kills to 1 in favor of the Iranians. The Iraqi Navy, led by Servile General Aladdin Hamad al-Janabi, had limited offensive equipment and was not even headed by an admiral. The Iranians devoted all their attention to defending the front and conducting aerial operations, knowing they would easily achieve naval superiority when the time came. The Iraqi naval engagement in the 1980s was not conclusive, as the Iraqi sailors fired Styx missiles within their range and retreated at full speed. The Iranian patrol boats easily avoided the salvo of missiles, but by the time they could retaliate, their adversaries were already safely in the estuary, leading them back to their base in Qasr. In late November, the Iranian chiefs of staff launched an inter-army operation called Morvarid, or Pearl, relying on Navy, ground force, and Air Force resources. Ship Captain Bahram Afzali led the first phase of the operation, which ended in hand-to-hand combat. The Iranians quickly took control of both terminals, and 3 helicopters from Karg Island, escorted by the Joshan and Pekin patrol boats, landed on the 2 terminals to deliver reinforcements and explosives. The Iraqis lost the ability to export oil extracted in the Basra area, a terrible blow to their war effort. General al-Janabi ordered the immediate recall of all available crews and for all seaworthy ships to deploy. The Iraqi boats baited the Iraqis perfectly, making it as if to escape towards Khor al-Amaya and Mina al-Baker. The Iraqi sailors fired a first salvo of Styx missiles, but the Iranian patrol boats dropped decoys and engaged in evasive actions. The Iraqi side tried to keep their adversary in place while waiting for the Air Force to intervene. The Pekin was eventually damaged by the nearby explosion of a Styx missile. In mid-morning, several phantoms from the Bushehr and Shiraz bases appeared over the water, guided by the Joshan and Pekan, as well as a Tomcat interceptor serving as an airborne radar station. Squad leader Abbas Doran piloted the lead plane, which fired a Maverick-guided missile, pulverizing a P-6 torpedo boat. The Iranian patrol boat managed to slalom and avoid the first Styx missile, but the following three made direct hits and disintegrated it. The Iraqi boats fired their last missiles but missed. The Iraqi Air Force attacked the Iraqi ships that had left Qasr, destroying the amphibious assault ship and causing panic among the patrol boats. The Iraqi Navy maintained a dissuasive presence around the Karg terminal, maintaining a naval blockade of Iraq. The Iraqi Navy regained control of the two destroyed oil terminals and reinstalled radar on Khor Alamaya, increasing its detection capacity in the direction of the Gulf. General al-Janabi admitted his failure to the Iraqi dictator, and Saddam Hussein never had the illusion that his navy could break the Iranian blockade. In December, the first freezing fogs of an early and rainy winter marked the end of the war's first phase. The Iranian forces significantly reinforced their front lines, rendering any breakthrough for Iraq illusory. The Iranian forces gained the upper hand on the seas and in the air. With the exception of Khorramshahr, Iraq had failed to seize any of the major cities originally targeted. The Iraqi dictator, Saddam Hussein, realized that without the atomic bomb, he could no longer win and had to take all necessary measures to avoid defeat. To maintain his image and status as a recognized leader of the Arab world, he focused on keeping a semblance of normalcy in Iraqi daily life. He maintained soldiers in the surge but refused to decree general mobilization. He continued to inject oil money into society, pursued public works policy, and ordered the acceleration of the Osirak nuclear power plant's completion. Saddam Hussein convinced the Gulf monarchies to finance his war effort, as his oil revenue had collapsed, and keeping the army on the front was tremendously expensive. After extensive discussions with his Minister of Defense, he decided to hold on to what they had won, without trying to obtain additional gains. The number of casualties remained acceptable for the time being, but material losses were far heavier. In Iran, the regime considered it had withstood the worst, and adopted a dynamic operational mode to slow Iraqi progress and limit their own losses. The Iranian government faced numerous challenges, including maintaining a balance between religious and secular camps, managing rivalries between the Pasdaran and regular army, and dealing with the growing difficulties of daily life. The price of oil remained high, guaranteeing Tehran a substantial income, and part of Iran's oil facilities were put back in service the following year. Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, the Supreme Leader's representative in the Supreme Defense Council, parsimoniously allocated funds to acquire military equipment, focusing on ammunition and spare parts. In January 1981, Iraqi authorities began planning the gradual recapture of territories annexed by the Iraqi army. The Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces believed that the operation could not be launched before spring to allow for reconfiguration, bolstering troops, and improving coordination between regular troops and the Revolutionary Guard. However, the clergy in Tehran wanted a quick first success to silence discontent stoked by revolts in Kurdistan and Iranian Azerbaijan. Ayatollah Beheshti, head of the Council of the Guardians of the Revolution, backed by Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, asked the Supreme Leader to settle the question in their favor. They were convinced that they would win either way, and if the first counteroff succeeded, they could claim responsibility for the victory. Iranian military high command planned Operation Hoviza, named after the small town targeted by the counteroffense. They assembled the necessary forces and ordered the 88th Brigade to be turned into an armored division in its own right. The new division lacked reconnaissance troops, mechanized battalions, or artillery. The Iranian army needed as many tanks as possible to press south toward the Karun, to encircle the Iraqi units spread along the river and isolate the 5th Mechanized Division. On January 5, 1981, Iranian military high command launched Operation Hovize, but the operation went awry from the very beginning. The Iraqis had their 9th Armored Division, reinforced by 240 tanks, and about 60 other armored vehicles. And the Iranians were decimated in rapid succession without any artillery or infantry support. On October 7th, the Iraqi commander launched a fire assault at enemy positions but was targeted by artillery. The Iraqi brigade successfully engaged the T-55s and T-62s in combat, which frequently ended at close range. The engagement ceased at nightfall, but the 88th Brigade's commander persisted and committed his last brigade. On January 8th, the Iranian tank crews launched a third assault without any more success than the previous day. In the afternoon, the remainder of the 88th Armored Division had no choice but to retreat. The Iraqis lost 214 Chieftains and 8 Cobra helicopters versus about 100 T-55s and T-62s on the Iraqi side. The Iraqis showed off by bringing war reporters to the field to show them the shells of bogged-down Chieftains and the burned-out wrecks of downed Cobras. They turned back to reinforce the Pasdaran under siege in the city by heading north along a secondary road starting in Hamidiyah. On January 10th, the paratroopers were on the front lines to defend Suzangerd, relieving the Revolutionary Guards, who had been under relentless siege for 3 months. Operation Hovizo was a dismal failure, with Awaz remaining under Iraqi artillery fire and Abadan still under siege. In late May, Abdul Rahman Qassemlu focused his efforts on Sanandaj, hoping that its fall would convince the Marivan garrison to surrender. In the Battle of Sanandaj, government troops lost 1,000 men, and Kurdish rebels lost nearly 2,000. By late June 1981, Abdul Rahman Qassemlu had liberated nearly all of Iraqi Kurdistan, except for Marivan, which refused to surrender despite its isolation. Iran's President Bani Sadr struggled to regain control of the insurgent region, with his priorities being to fight revolts in Azerbaijan and Kurdistan provinces, hold off Iraqis along the front, and justify himself in the face of harsh criticism. The Iraqi front became secondary, and the Iraqi command restructured its military to counter Iran's forces. They proposed a spectacular raid to show the Iraqis that the Iraqi Air Force could strike their territory anywhere it wanted. On April 4, 1981, Israelis discovered that the H-3 aircraft was a prime target due to aerial photographs sent by the Israelis. Iranian strategists chose an itinerary through Turkey and Syria to attack the Iraqis from the rear. Top Iranian authorities asked Hafez al-Assad to look the other way for a few hours, which the Syrian president agreed to. 10 Phantoms took off from the base in Hamadan, heading northwest for the Turkish border. The mission was coordinated from a Boeing 747 serving as a flying command post. The Phantoms flew low over the Turkish mountains before turning southwest to enter Syria. They flew at very low altitude over the desert plain separating Syria from Iraq to the rendezvous point with 2 other refueling planes. The Phantoms then crossed the Iraqi border and headed for H-3. As they approached the target, they divided into 3 sections to appear from 3 opposite directions and disorient anti-aircraft defense. They suddenly appeared over H-3, completely surprising the base's defenses. They flew 4 bombing runs, creating total chaos and destroying 8 MiG-23s, 5 Su-20s, 4 MiG-21s, 2 Mirage F-1s, 1 Tu-16 bomber, 3 transport An-12s, and 4 Mi-8 helicopters. About 50 other planes were severely damaged and approximately 30 technicians were killed. The Phantoms abruptly ended the attack and returned to base, refueling twice in northern Syria and Iraqi airspace. The Iraqi pilots landed on the base in Hamadan 4 hours and 40 minutes after the mission had started, putting more than 40 Iraqi aircraft out of commission without suffering a single loss. On June 3, 1981, the Israeli government ordered the destruction of the Osirak nuclear power plant in Iraq to put an end to the Iraqi nuclear power program. The Israeli Army's command launched Operation Opera, using data from French engineers and Iranian authorities. The attack formation was led by Lieutenant Colonel Zeev Raz, Colonel Iftach Spector, and Lieutenant Ilan Ramon, who would later become Israel's first astronaut. The mission was difficult due to the defense of the target by SAM-6 batteries, anti-aircraft artillery, and a MiG-23 squadron. However, Israeli military command had implemented an exceptional system to retrieve pilots forced to eject from their planes. On June 7, 1981, 8 F-16 fighter bombers escorted by 6 F-15s took off from Etzion Air Base, crossing the Gulf of Aqaba skirting the Jordanian border, and entering Saudi airspace headed for Iraq. The formation flew in total radio silence, flying in total radio silence. Upon reaching the target, the pilots jettisoned their external fuel tanks and accelerated to the maximum speed allowed by their heavy cargo. They split in two, continuing at very low altitude on an ascending trajectory directly aimed at their target. The remaining 7 F-16s released both bombs, destroying the plant's main reactor, containment dome, and underground research lab. The Israeli planes safely returned to Etzion Air Base, and the Israeli government issued a communique declaring the destruction of the Iraqi nuclear power plant. King Hussein of Jordan was informed that his airspace had been crossed by lost Israeli fighters, but had ordered his fighter planes not to leave the ground. The destruction of the Osirak nuclear plant by Iraq led to the dismissal of air defense heads and the arrest of General Shaker Mahmoud, a deputy director of air defense. This defeat humiliated the Iraqi Air Force, leading to a focus on air superiority missions over future support missions. The destruction of the Osirak plant denied Saddam Hussein the nuclear power status that would have allowed him to dissuade Iran from continuing the war and impose himself as a natural leader in the Arab world. Saddam Hussein accelerated his population's mobilization effort and ordered the nuclear program to continue, but none of his partners supported this project. He did not order retaliatory raids against Israel but increased support for Palestinians' independency movement and terrorist attacks on Israeli interests. The destruction of the Osirak plant served the Iraqi regime, limiting the risks of nuclear proliferation and reassuring European governments about delivering weapons to Iraq. In June 1981, Iranian President Bani Sadr faced political turmoil due to radical clergy members accusing him of treason and ties with CIA executives. A document by CIA agent Vernon Cassin revealed that American intelligence agencies had attempted to recruit Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, but Bani Sadr refused to accept the offer. Confident in Khomeini's decision, Bani Sadr resorted to relying on Khomeini's decision to determine his fate. On June 11, 1981, Khomeini stripped Bani Sadr of his army commander-in-chief position. Bani Sadr was dismissed from the presidency and placed in temporary custody. Bani Sadr escaped and went into hiding, hiding with trusted friends. The next day, his Minister of Defense died in an explosion. The Prime Minister, Head of Parliament, and Secretary General of the IRP formed a triumvirate to form a government until presidential elections could be held. However, the People's Mujahideen launched a campaign of terrorist attacks, leading to the decapitation of the IRP's headquarters on June 28, 1981. Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani and Ali Khamenei emerged as two younger mullahs who had been scheming for supreme power. Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, a former insurgent and strategist, lived underground during the Shah's regime to avoid imprisonment. He aimed to establish a theocracy that preserved revolutionary gains alongside a market economy, fueling his hostility towards Marxist-aligned groups like the People's Mujahideen. Rafsanjani was ready to make any alliance to achieve his goal, including with outside forces, as long as they did not question the Islamic Republic's dependence or sovereignty. Ali Khamenei, a 41-year-old intellectual, represented the regime's most Jacobin faction and was deeply involved in Shia Islam. He believed that the advent of the Islamic Republic would halt the return of the hidden imam and preserve his revolutionary legacy. Rafsanjani and Khamenei knew that the future belonged to them if they backed each other and intelligently shared power. During the summer of 1981, Iran underwent a radical second phase of its Islamic revolution, with over 2,000 witnesses arrested and executed. The provisional government focused on the internal front, and combat with Iraqis was limited to artillery duels and harassment operations. With the support of Ayatollah Khomeini, Ali Rajai was elected President of the Republic, and Mohammad Javad Bahonar was appointed Prime Minister to maintain power sharing between different spheres of society. A new government was formed, with laypeople close to religious circles including Minister of Defense Colonel Ol Namju and Minister of Foreign Affairs Mir Hossein Mousavi. Abul Hassan Bani Sadr and Masoud Rajavi, former Iranian presidents, decided to go into exile and continue their struggle from abroad. They entered the Mehrabad airbase disguised as regular soldiers and carried fake IDs. They boarded an aerial refueling Boeing 707 and claimed a mechanical failure as a pretext to escape to Turkey. Ankara refused to offer Bani Sadr political asylum, so they continued to France, where they were granted political asylum on condition that they renounce any political activism contrary to their status as refugees. Bani Sadr and Rajavi's asylum in France caused a sudden degradation in the strained relations between Paris and Tehran. The Ayatollah Khomeini referred to France as a little Satan, and the French government held French nationals in Iran, causing a hostage crisis. Paris radicalized its line against Tehran and increased its arms shipments to Iraq, signing the Vulcan contract with Baghdad. The Iranian government used Air Force personnel's involvement in Bani Sadr and Rajavi's escape to justify another purge of the Air Force. Most missions were cancelled, pilots were grounded, and arms carried were limited to prevent pilots from attacking the regime's symbols. Terrorist attacks continued in Tehran, Tabriz, Shiraz, and Esfahan during the Iranian Revolution. On August 30, 1981, an explosion rocked government headquarters, killing the president and several other ministers. The Iranian executive branch was decimated again, and the Ayatollah Khomeini decided to put power entirely in the clergy's hands. They divided responsibilities, with Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani remaining Speaker of Parliament and in charge of finances, and Ali Khamenei elected President of the Republic. Ali Larijani, a 24-year-old engineer and son of an Ayatollah, was promoted to Deputy Minister for Social Affairs and later Minister of Information, Secretary of the National Security Council, and Chief Nuclear Negotiator. He ran unsuccessfully in the 2005 presidential election and became Speaker of Parliament. To avoid friction, Rafsanjani and Khamenei appointed Mir Hossein Mousavi as Prime Minister, who would serve as a buffer for their antagonistic personalities. Ali Akbar Velayati was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs, while Colonel Ol Namju was confided as Minister of Defense. Mohammad Khatami, a reformist candidate, was elected president in 1997 on a reformist platform, promising to improve women's status and broaden young people's rights. He was forced to withdraw at the end of his second term, to make way for Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who has since been active in the reformist camp, calling for Iran to open up to the outside world while retaining the advances of the Islamic Revolution. In 1981, a generation of men in their 40s held power in Tehran, with the most influential institutions being in the hands of the clergy. The Ayatollah Khomeini appointed Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani as the new commander of the armed forces responsible for chairing parliament, managing the regime's finances, and leading the war effort. Rafsanjani was determined to establish himself as a future president and possibly even a supreme leader. He invested himself in running the war, reigning in the chiefs of staff, and giving the Pasdaran more power. On September 29, 1981, the C-130 carrying the chiefs of staff crashed, killing 38 people. Rafsanjani took advantage of this opportunity to promote new officers closer to the clergy, such as General Qasim Ali Zahir Nejad, Colonel Hassan Mojampur, and Colonel Mohammad Salimi. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps gained visibility, with Mohsen Rezai and Ali Shamkhani taking command. To increase their grip on the armed forces, the mullahs appointed a political ideological director to each general staff to serve as political commissar. Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani retained the Supreme Defense Council but implemented an unofficial parallel chain of command that was more flexible and reactive. He also popularized the concept of the jihad, or holy war, to guide Iraqi combatants and asked the chiefs of staff to name all subsequent operations after events in the history of Shia Islam. This new military doctrine implicitly favored resorting to the only inexpensive resource the Republic had in large quantities: its troops. In September 1981, Iranian leadership launched two offensives to recapture territories they had lost a year earlier. In Khuzestan, Pasdaran brigades attacked Iraqi outposts, aiming to wear down their adversaries and make them yield ground. The Iraqis expected armored battalions to burst into view, but were forced to pull back to avoid being overrun. Meanwhile, the Iranian military high command established mixed units composed of regular troops and Revolutionary Guards. The 8th Imam offensive aimed to break the siege of Abadan and liberate the eastern bank of the Karun River. The Iraqi 5th Division's chiefs of staff were pounded by Iranian artillery, and the Pasdaran advanced under the artillery's rolling fire. The Iranians learned from their past mistakes and rediscovered the virtues of the steamroller, allowing them to control the Karun's eastern bank and reopen the road from Awaz to Abadan. Meanwhile, Iranian authorities focused on Kurdistan, mobilizing 60,000 combatants, half of them Pasdaran, to regain control of the rebel province. The Iranians' objective was to capture Sanandaj, where the PDKI had concentrated its best troops. In October, the military high command launched the offensive against Sanandaj, capturing Saqqez, Bukhan, Mahabad, Piranshar, Nakkadeh, and Urmia. However, the Peshmergas were forced to retreat, and launched a counterattack in the direction of Piranshar to reopen the road for supplies from Iraq. In November, governmental authorities were once again in control of the main road from Sanandaj to Urmia, with the Peshmergas taking refuge in their mountain stronghold. Abdul Rahman Ghasemlu, the new chief of staff in Tehran, decided to shift his efforts to Khuzestan during the winter and wait for combat to begin again in spring. General Nejad launched Operation Tariq al-Quds in November 1981, mobilizing 20,000 soldiers and 60 tanks to control Boston. The Iranian objective was to take control of the town and continue in the direction of the nearby Iraqi border so they could claim a symbolic victory before year's end. The Pasdaran advanced in 2 columns, each following a bank of the Karkeh River. The Iraqis were determined to hold this position to prevent the Iranians from setting foot on Iraqi soil. Over 3 days, the Iraqi infantrymen entrenched in Boston, holding off the Iranians' repeated assaults. On December 6th, the Pasdaran and the paratroopers seized Boston, while the Iraqis withdrew to a position a few miles away under freezing rain. On December 12, 1981, the Iranian military high command launched Operation Matla-ul-Fajr, which translates to sunrise or break of dawn, in the Qasr-e-Shirin sector. The Iranian 15th Mountain Infantry Brigade attacked Geylan Zarb and Sari-Poli Zahab by night, but were taken by surprise and had to abandon their positions. The weather also played a role, preventing the Iraqi Air Force from intervening, which, well, eased the Iranians' efforts. By the end of 1981, the Iranians had managed to reclaim close to 40% of the territory captured by the Iraqis. The Iraqi army took advantage of the winter truce to reinforce and consolidate its positions, including the erection of a so-called Persian wall to protect Khorramshahr. The Iranian government built a complex defensive system to protect the city of Basra, which was strategically important for Iraq's financial hub and access to the Gulf. Engineers constructed a 10-foot-tall and 30-foot-wide compacted soil and sand rampart along the city's northeast edge, with tanks deployed at the top to cover the desert plain. Dismounted infantrymen stayed further back to counterattack any assault. Bulldozers razed buildings and groves, while heavy artillery was assembled on the Shatt al-Arab's western bank. Baghdad also increased its ground troops to 450,000 men, with 3 new infantry divisions established. Saddam Hussein openly considered using chemical weapons to contain Iranian troops' advances, but this was a distant memory. To cut losses, the Iraqis reinforced the sector with the 11th Division, and sent several popular army brigades to reinforce the garrison in Khorramshahr. Tehran also strengthened its military by creating 2 new infantry divisions and a mechanized division, the 40th, supplied with tanks from Libya and equipment captured from the Iraqi army. To increase pressure on Baghdad, Tehran decided to radically reduce Iraq's oil export capacity. The Iranian authorities repeatedly made overtures to President Assad to convince him to close the Kirkuk-Banias pipeline, which allowed Iraq to transport up to 550,000 barrels of oil per day. The Syrian president pointed out the revenue he would lose by closing the pipeline, but Iran assured him they were prepared to compensate him by signing a generous oil supply agreement with Syria. Tehran committed to buying a significant amount of Syrian products, which Damascus had trouble moving. The agreement would provide Syria with a net income of roughly $1 billion per year, as much as it was annually given by Saudi Arabia for the struggle against Israel. President Assad agreed to it, but he sparked incidents at the Syrian-Iranian border, leading to the closure of the Kirkuk-Banias pipeline and lockdown of the border with Iraq. This was a blow to the Iraqi regime, which had lost a crucial outlet for its oil and revenue. Contact was made with Turkey to increase the Kirkuk-Dortyol pipeline's capacity, and to begin the construction of a new parallel pipeline with a 400,000 barrel per day capacity. Construction began in early summer and ended 2 years later. The Iraqis also played the Jordanian card and doubled the number of tanker trucks traveling between Kirkuk, Baghdad, and the port of Aqaba on the Red Sea, allowing them to move 25,000 barrels per day, bringing their total export capacity to 700,000 barrels daily. The Iraqi regime had the potential to export slightly more than 1 million barrels per day, but its production was in decline and consumed by the war, making it unable to meet this target. Iran successfully extracted slightly over 2 million barrels daily, of which 4/5 were exported. Iranian strategists decided to focus their efforts on the sector of Shush, positioning themselves to strike the center of gravity in Amara, on the main Baghdad-Basra road. Over a year, Iraqis had been pumping oil from the Dayloran Musayan and Fakeh oil fields to fill Baghdad's shops. The Iranian chiefs of staff named the large offensive Fath, meaning victory, and mobilized 120,000 men in 4 regular army divisions, 3 Pasdaran divisions, 2 artillery brigades, 1 helicopter brigade and the 55th Parachute Brigade. They gathered significant anti-aircraft resources to repel the Iraqi Air Force. Baghdad relied on its air force to hold back potential Iranian breakthroughs in this sector held by the 4th Corps. On March 17, 1982, the Iranians launched Operation Fatima in the direction of Hoveyzeh and Hamid, which succeeded in deceiving Iraqi military command. General Najad and General Shirazi mounted their general offensive in the direction of Fakeh, with the 55th Parachute Brigade taking control of Ain Kosh without encountering any opposition. As human waves broke at the foot of Iraqi defenses, several thousand Basijis fought alongside the Pasdaran for the first time in the war. Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani had traveled from Tehran to galvanize them, promising them to listen to their last breath for the glory of God, the Islamic Revolution, and the nation. The Iranian generals launched the second phase of their offense, infected enemy lines, and evaded the Iraqi tanks. The 10th Armored Division's tank crews called the Air Force to the rescue, repelling the Pasdaran's frontal attacks. The Iraqi division's commanders asked for authorization to retreat, but authorization was delayed to give the chiefs of staff time to assess the situation's gravity. General Dakhil Ali Hilali surrendered to Saddam Hussein's wrath, and the 10th Armored Division lost all its artillery and tanks. The Iranian High Command launched the third phase of its offensive, Fath ul-Mobin, meaning undeniable victory, on March 27. The 77th Mechanized Division pressed on to Fakeh, hoping to take control of the strategic crossroads along the Tigris. However, they faced resistance from the Iraqi infantrymen, who had to yield ground after losing 2 of their brigades. On March 29, Iraqi troops re-established themselves about 6 miles from the border, using the terrain as best they could to reconstitute a cohesive defense line. The Iranians assembled several armored brigades in Cezare to send them to assault Fakeh, but they mistakenly left the protected zone covered by Hawk missile batteries deployed near Shush. The military command launched an air attack on the armored columns, destroying close to 100 tanks and forcing the Iranians to retreat. Saddam Hussein learned the importance of sparing the Air Force and ordered future support missions to attack the helicopters. The victory served as a model for the rest of the war and was considered a textbook case taught in Iranian military academies. In 1982, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or OIC, attempted to mediate between Iran and Iraq, led by Tunisian Habib Chatti. The plan included withdrawal from Iraqi territory, establishing a buffer force, creating an international committee to arbitrate the Shatt al-Arab conflict and evaluating Iran's damages. The Gulf Cooperation Council offered a compensation fund for Iran. Tehran responded favorably, but Iraq rejected the demands. The Algerian government aimed to convince Iran to accept a ceasefire, but Saddam Hussein accused them of favoring the Iranian side. On May 3, 1982, a commercial Gulf stream carrying Algerian Foreign Minister Mohammed Sedek Ben Yahya was shot down, causing Algerians to unleash fury at both sides. The Algerian authorities no longer interfered in the conflict. The United Nations, or UN, failed to convince the belligerents to put an end to hostilities after the war began. The UN Security Council adopted Resolution 479, asking both parties to abstain from resorting to force and calling on the international community to do everything in its power to avoid the conflict's expansion. UN Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim tried to convince Baghdad and Tehran to put down their weapons, but Iraqi Presidents Ali Khamenei and Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani met each proposal with a scathing response. Non-aligned countries led by India and Cuba shuffled between Tehran and Baghdad to try and find their own negotiated end to the conflict. Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi condemned the use of violence and refused to take sides with either of the belligerents. However, Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi agreed to send Tehran defensive military equipment in exchange for oil purchased at a bargain price. Pakistani President Zia-ul-Haq also unsuccessfully attempted to mediate between Baghdad and Tehran, but refused to deliver Tehran weapons to preserve his status as an arbitrator of the Islamic cause and his lucrative relationship with Saudi Arabia, which was hostile to Iran. In the Gulf, the belligerents' inflexibility revived the Gulf Cooperation Council's, or GCC's, security agenda. An internal security treaty was made by 5 of the 6 council members, authorizing their security forces to intervene on each other's territory to combat any destabilization effectively operated from abroad. In 1982, U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz implemented a new regional policy aimed at improving U.S. credibility in the Middle East. This policy aimed to accelerate a settlement of the Palestinian problem and support Iraq to reduce the threat Iran posed to the Gulf monarchies. The U.S. administration's tilt towards Baghdad during the Iran-Iraq conflict was not due to preference for one of the two reprehensible regimes, but because they wanted neither to win the war and were worried that Iraq would prove to be the weaker. Events such as the destruction of the Osirak nuclear power plant, the clergy's rise to power in Tehran, and King Hussein of Jordan and Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak's entreaties convinced Ronald Reagan to support Iraq. The U.S. authorized the CIA to secretly provide military equipment to Iraq on condition that it was not American-made. Large quantities of Soviet-made weapons and ammunition were purchased on the gray market and delivered to Iraq. Reagan persuaded Congress to remove Iraq from the list of states supporting terrorism, making it possible to reestablish bilateral commercial ties, bank loans, and American investments in Iraq. In spring 1982, Washington initiated a rapprochement with Baghdad, establishing informal first contacts and re-establishing communication. The Kremlin faced a dilemma between maintaining Saddam Hussein's regime under embargo and not allowing Iraq to collapse. The Soviets' advisors in Baghdad sent back alarming reports emphasizing the Iraqi army's inability to contend with the Iranian combatants. Marshal Ustinov, the Iraqi regime's most faithful advocate, managed to convince his peers to accept that heavy weapons be urgently delivered to Baghdad. In early April 1982, Abdul Rahman Ghassemlou, the leader of the Iranian Kurds, launched an attempt to recapture cities lost the previous fall. However, his troops made no headway outside Piranshar, which was strongly held by a regular army brigade. Bani Sadr, the former president of Pakistan, declined the offer to return to Iran to establish a parallel government advocating the ouster of Imam Khomeini from the mountains of Kurdistan. The Iranian authorities launched a counteroffensive and the Iranians regained control of the 4 cities they had lost. On April 30, 1982, the Iranians launched the Beit al-Muqaddas offensive to recapture Khorramshahr and drive the Iraqis out of Khuzestan. General Najad and General Shirazi mobilized 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, 600 cannons, and nearly 100 helicopters for the operation. However, their weak point was their lack of airstrike capacity, logistical problems, and pilots' fear. The Iraqi military high command relied on Hawk surface-to-air missiles to prevent the Iraqi Air Force from flying over the battlefield. The Iraqis had 5 divisions and 10 autonomous brigades, with half deployed in Khorramshahr and the other half staggered between Amara and Hamid. The Iraqi 3rd Corps commander, General Al-Qadi, hesitated about how to respond and where to focus his efforts to contain the Iraqis. General Shamshal, the chief of staff of the armed forces, provided him with advice, but the commander opted for inelastic defense with what remained of his armored and mechanized troops. The Iraqis took advantage of the Iraqis' procrastination to commit their 23rd Special Forces Brigade and 25th and 58th Infantry Divisions as reinforcements. On May 7th to 8th, the Iranians launched their offensive, causing a brutal artillery shelling and chasing the Iraqi 6th and 9th Armored Divisions to the border. The 9th Division disintegrated and Saddam Hussein replaced its commander, General Talha al-Duri, with General Kamal Latif. The 88th Armored Division seized control of Hosseinia, forcing Saddam Hussein's troops to retreat to Khorramshahr. The Iranian army restocked munitions and transported thousands of young volunteers to the front lines. The Iraqis then attacked Khorramshahr, allowing them to establish themselves as the driving force of the Iranian armed forces. The Iraqi artillery let loose, forcing the Iraqis to hole up in their positions. The 55th Parachute Brigade took control of the town and destroyed the pontoon bridge over the Shatt al-Arab, isolating the Khorramshahr garrison. The Iranians assaulted Khorramshahr, causing heavy losses and a rout. Iraqi pilots tried to break the Iraqi troops' momentum, but they failed. The galvanized Pasdaran were ready to make any sacrifice to give their leaders a victory, and by nightfall Iran had taken 12,000 prisoners. In 1982, the Iranian regime declared the liberation of Khorramshahr, a city that had been twice martyred. The Iraqis suffered heavy losses, including 8,000 dead, 19,000 prisoners, and 15,000 wounded. Saddam Hussein recognized the failure of his crusade and sought to end the war. He congratulated General Aziz and criticized officials responsible for the Khorramshahr debacle, leading to the dismissal of several military high command members. The Iraqi president appointed a Kurd, Taha Maruf, vice president of the Revolutionary Command Council, and promoted several commanders of Kurdish or Shiite backgrounds to general. The regime also restored the Shiite mausoleums in Najaf and Karbala and started a national loan program to accelerate large-scale construction projects and create a compensation fund for war casualties. Saddam's portrait was printed on each national treasury bond to comfort the population and convince them to invest in the loan. In 1982, the Israeli government invaded South Lebanon to chase down Palestinian guerrilla forces. Saddam Hussein, led by Menachem Begin, announced his readiness to end hostilities with Iran and bring his troops back to Iraq to fight the Israeli aggressor. On June 10, Saddam Hussein unilaterally proclaimed a ceasefire and accepted the principal conditions decreed by Tehran: withdrawal from the conquered territories and payment of reparations via voluntary contributions made by the Arab states supporting Baghdad. He explicitly recognized the border delineation as defined by the Algiers Accord of 1975, and allowed that if Iraqi troops were sent to Lebanon, he would grant them right of passage. However, the Iraqi dictator rejected 2 of the Iranians' demands: his stepping down and the repatriation of the 100,000 Shiites expelled to Iran before the beginning of hostilities. Now that their territory had been liberated and most of their demands had been met, Saddam gambled on the Iranians demonstrating rationality and seizing the opportunity to end the war. If they declined, he relied on the active solidarity of his Arab allies, who he believed would enable him to continue an attrition-based war, assuming that the Iranians would no longer be able to conduct large-scale operations against Iraq. The ceasefire proposal was staunchly supported by King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, who declared he was ready to pay $80 billion to persuade the Iranian government to accept the Iraqi offer. However, the Iranians demanded $150 billion, probably in hopes of getting $100 billion. Offended, the Saudi monarch withdrew his order and aligned himself with Iraq. The announcement of the ceasefire and Iraqi withdrawal led to a pivotal debate in Tehran, with Ayatollah Khomeini initially refusing to pronounce himself, choosing instead to listen to both sides' arguments. Ayatollah Montazeri and Ali Khamenei were against continuing the war, arguing that after 20 months of deadly conflict, the population yearned for peace. Prime Minister Mousavi and Minister of Defense Salimi had no say in the matter, and the army's leadership had serious reservations, emphasizing the scale of the losses they had sustained. Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani insisted on continuing the war, arguing that Saddam Hussein had to be punished and overthrown to give Iraqi Shiites a chance to seize power and turn Iraq into an Islamic republic on the Iranian model. The Speaker of Parliament cast doubt on Saddam's good faith and wagered that his army would not withdraw from all the territory conquered. Events proved Rafsanjani right, as Iraqi troops kept control of ridges against the border to protect access to Baghdad. Rafsanjani reminded the supreme leader that the Iraqi army could turn the Iraqi withdrawal into a major Iraqi victory by attacking immediately. The Iraqi government led the Iraqi people to believe that the Iraqi army was still occupying a significant part of Iran, justifying the war's continuation. The Iraqi military high command prepared a general offensive against Iraq, focusing on breaching the enemy layout at two distinct points, isolating Basra and Kirkuk, and converged toward Baghdad, encouraging Shiite communities to rise up. On July 12, 1982, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 514, calling on the two belligerents to put an immediate stop to hostilities. Saddam Hussein accepted the terms of the resolution, while Ayatollah Khomeini rejected it and called for the Iraqi people to rise up against him. On July 13, 1982, Tehran launched the Blessed Ramadan operation during Ramadan to initiate the third phase of the Iran-Iraq War. The attack was initially directed at the Basra sector, held by the Iraqi Third Army Corps. The Iranian tanks advanced about 10 miles before being stopped by violent counterattacks by Iraqi tanks. The Iraqi generals called in their air force, which mercilessly bombarded the enemy columns. The Iranians were eventually pushed back to their initial positions and redeployed further north to participate in the offensive's second phase. On July 17, Saddam Hussein ordered his army to recapture Qasr-e-Shirin, but they were defeated by the Iranian command. The Iranians then launched another offensive in the Basra sector, but were slowed down by minefields, water-filled trenches, artillery, and tanks. On July 23, the Iranians realized they would not break through in this sector, and no longer had sufficient forces to attack in the direction of Kirkuk. They decided to change strategies and edge forward on a narrow strip of land along the border, opposite Basra and Haritha. The Iranian command postponed its offensive to restock munitions and drinking water, explaining the defeat to Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. The failed offensive cost them 12,000 dead and 300 tanks, while the Iraqis lost 150 tanks and 5,000 men. Rafsanjani provided the Pasdaran ministry with the means to equip and train itself without relying on military support. Rafsanjani chose Rafi Qudus to take care of logistics and weapons supplies for the Revolutionary Guards, implicitly permitting him to get rich along the way. Mohsen Rezai and Ali Shamkhani were confirmed as commander and deputy commander of the Pasdaran, a part of the Iranian military. The Basij became a full-fledged component of the ministry, with 10 regional commands and 8 central management departments. The Pasdaran received priority in the allocation of captured and foreign-bought equipment. Young conscripts who chose to serve with the Pasdaran received various advantages, such as higher pay, longer leave, faster promotion, free access to university, and numerous public services. Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani created an ad hoc military high command responsible for supervising operations on the Iraqi front. This body supervised 4 regional commands, each responsible for one sector of the front: Khuzestan, Faqqa, Qasr-e-Shirin, and Kurdistan. Rafsanjani also pushed to create a military branch of the Iranian Hezbollah called the Quds Force, charged with special operations that could not be assigned to the Pasdaran. In August 1982, Saddam Hussein retaliated by establishing a maritime exclusion zone in the northern part of the Gulf. The Iraqi president had three objectives: to put pressure on Iran and force Tehran to accept a ceasefire, intimidate shipping companies that delivered refined gasoline to Iran and exported its crude petroleum, and force Iranian leaders into error to block maritime traffic on the Strait of Hormuz. The Iraqi Navy contributed to the oil blockade in a more restricted fashion, limiting itself to nocturnal operations to avoid the Iranian Air Force. General Al-Kabi, the Navy's new commander, proved more enterprising and imaginative than his predecessor, conducting harassing raids close to Iranian shores. In 1982, the Iraqi Navy deployed missile boats and reinforced escorts for merchant ships sailing to Karg and Bandar Khomeini. The Iranians deployed several missile boats on site and reinforced the escorts for merchant ships sailing to the island. 12 days later, a marauding Super Frelon engaged with the last operational PF-103 corvette, severely damaging it. The Iraqi Navy also had two batteries of CSS-C2 surface-to-sea missiles positioned at the tip of the Al-Faw Peninsula to cover the area surrounding the Khor Musa Channel. The Iraqi Air Force bombed the vast Karg terminal 7 times, causing significant damage to oil tanks scattered across the island. The Shah's foresight prevented Iran's export capacity from being significantly affected, as the terminal had to export 6 million barrels per day, or twice its oil production capacity at the time. The Iraqi regime dispatched several batteries of Hawk and anti-air defense missiles to the island, and the 5 Tomcats were put in permanent rotation to provide operational watch over the oil terminal. The Iraqi Air Force and Navy turned to the Nowruz, Baregansar, Ardashir, and Sarush oil platforms in the northernmost part of the Gulf, leading to significant oil leaks and a major oil spill. The Iranian Air Force continued its sporadic attacks on Iraq, but most of their raids were repelled by the increasingly effective Iraqi anti-air defense. The Iraqi oil blockade only had a marginal effect on Iran, with only 2% of tankers serving Iranian terminals affected. Tehran took conservative measures to protect Karg and limit its impact. On October 1, 1982, the Iranian High Command launched the Muslim Ibn Aqil offensive to breach enemy lines in Kanakin and Mandali, aiming to advance toward Bakuba and threaten Baghdad. The Iraqi generals had 60,000 men, 300 tanks and cannons, while the Iranian military high command hoped to gain ground and force the enemy to redeploy troops around its capital. However, they were defeated by armored formations of tanks and dismounted infantrymen, exhausting their stock of TOW missiles and relying on Soviet-made anti-tank weapons. Saddam Hussein traveled to the front to harangue his troops and exhort them to hold firm, but the Iranian delegation rejected it. The UN Security Council adopted a new resolution, number 522, proposing impartial observers to oversee a ceasefire, which was rejected by the Iraqi regime. The Iranian command accepted that it would not be able to break through and ordered a tactical withdrawal to the ridges dominating Mandali to the east. The Iranian command then called an end to the massive attack tactic until the Pasdaran units were provided more appropriate and effective equipment. The Speaker of Parliament faced attacks from the military high command, who reproached him for interfering in the conduct of operations. Ayatollah Khomeini and Ali Khamenei stepped in to defend the military, emphasizing the heavy losses among his Pasdaran. Rafsanjani declared that it would be wise to adopt an attrition strategy based on high-impact operations designed to weaken the enemy, and called for an end to the massive attack tactic until the Pasdaran units were provided more appropriate and effective equipment. In 1982, Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani revived the Iranian nuclear program with the blessing of Ayatollah Khomeini. 3 teams of researchers and engineers were reconstituted and allocated vast resources for construction on the Bushehr power station. However, the Iranian regime struggled to find partners to support the rebuilding, with none of the large nations specializing in civil nuclear engineering willing to help Tehran advance. France and Germany were contacted, but construction work on the Bushehr power station advanced slowly due to a lack of means and experienced scientists. Saddam Hussein ordered the bombing of Iranian cities, and the Iraqi regime used 3 Scud-B missiles to signal their readiness to follow Iran in its escalation to total war. Tehran launched a new offensive called Holy Muharram, aiming to repel Iraqis and control the oil fields along the border. The Iranian offensive ended with the Iranians losing 4,000 men, killing 3,000 Iraqis, and taking 3,500 prisoners. In mid-September, Iranian authorities launched a new offensive in Kurdistan province to regain control of the border road between Saqqez and Piranshar. The Peshmergas used this road for weapons and equipment deliveries, traveling via the passes leading from the Iraqi border to the cities of Sardasht and Bana. General Shirazi mobilized 80,000 men divided in 3 regular divisions, and fierce fighting stretched on for several weeks, leaving 2,500 dead among the Pasdaran and twice that in the governmental forces. Saddam Hussein granted an amnesty to Kurdish detainees and multiplied measures to benefit local populations to avoid facing a general insurrection in Kurdistan. The front stabilized during the winter of 1982 to 1983, with each belligerent improving its defensive positions to prevent the enemy from infiltrating its lines. The Iraqi side built a network of trenches, blockhouses, tank firing positions, anti-tank ditches, electronic surveillance equipment, cameras, and thermal sensors to detect any attempt at infiltration. Logistic depots were built less than 3 miles from the front lines, so units could be more quickly resupplied. The Soviet Union radically changed its stance on the conflict during the winter of 1982 to 1983. The appointment of a new head of the Kremlin, Yuri Andropov, and the growing hostility toward Moscow led the Kremlin to tighten its bonds with Baghdad. The Iranian regime expelled the Soviet spies and increased its support for Afghan freedom fighters, but held off from severing diplomatic ties with Moscow. The Kremlin halted military aid to Tehran, while the Soviet leaders extended military support to Baghdad. The Iraqi army received 140 MiG-23 and Su-22 gun bombers, about 5 Mi-17 and Mi-24 helicopters, several hundred T-72 tanks and BMP-1 armored vehicles, and about 102 S-1 and 2 S-3 self-propelled guns, as well as 10 Il-76 transport planes. The Kremlin maintained a neutral stance, defending Iraqi positions and quarantining the Iranian government. It believed that Iran would eventually seek Soviet assistance to re-establish proper relations with the Soviet Union. The break between Moscow and Tehran forced the Chinese government to reconsider its stance and actively courted Tehran. Beijing's advances were welcomed by the Iranian regime, which agreed to pay high prices for Chinese-manufactured products, especially weapons and ammunition. To maintain appearances, China called on North Korea to serve as an intermediary between Beijing and Tehran. Most weapons delivered to Iran were supplied by North Korea, but were actually manufactured in China. China continued to honor its contract with Iraq while supplying Iran, balancing deliveries to maintain the status quo. In January 1983, the Iranian government published a map of the front, showing 7 pockets of Iranian territory controlled by the Iraqi army. It suggested that Baghdad would agree to negotiate talks if Baghdad agreed to evacuate and recognize Iraq's sovereignty over these few thousand square miles. Saddam Hussein rejected the proposal but agreed to discuss the terms of a ceasefire with Ayatollah Khomeini in Tehran. The Speaker of Parliament convinced his peers to launch a new offensive called Prelude, which aimed to deal a decisive blow to their enemies' morale and offer the Iranian regime a symbolic success. The Iraqi government rejected the Iraqi proposal, emphasizing that the issue now was to punish the Iraqi leaders. The military high command was ordered to prepare an offensive to capture Faqqa and cut off the main road connecting Baghdad to Basra. Under torrential downpour, 2 Pasdaran divisions attacked the Iraqi front lines to lure the Iraqis into believing they were launching a pincer attack on Amara. However, General Fakhri pushed back the Iranian assaults, relying on a solid defensive layout and motivated soldiers. The Iraqi tanks maneuvered to make a net trap around the Iraqi vanguard, while several infantry regiments closed breaches in the Iraqi trenches. Operation Prelude, a major offensive by the Iranians, was adjourned after it suffered a severe defeat, losing over 100 tanks and 5,000 dead and 12,000 wounded. The Ba'athist regime had galvanized Iraqi soldiers, but the unexpected victory had galvanized them. Iranian command turned to an attrition strategy based on infantry and artillery, stashed tanks in the rear, and used them only to support infantrymen's advance. The war continued, with Iranian divisions burrowing along the front, alternating artillery duels, shock attacks, and long periods of waiting. In February 1983, the Iraqi president called on the international community to pressure the Iranian government to accept an end to hostilities. The UN, OIC, and the non-aligned movement publicly denounced Tehran's inflexibility and both sides' poor treatment of prisoners of war. King Hussein of Jordan visited the front with the Iraqi president, inspecting the Jordanian contingent deployed there. General Adnan Khairallah ordered the construction of barrack buildings, mosques, and rec rooms to improve the comfort of Iraqi soldiers. A rotation system was implemented, allowing each unit to train for 6 weeks in the rear and hold positions for 4 months on the front, then enjoy 2 or 3 weeks of leave. The first major Iranian offensive of the spring of 1983 took place on April 10, with the Iranians committing 3 infantry divisions to the battle. The Iraqi command captured several hills overlooking Fakkeh, eliminating snipers as they went. Tariq Aziz made an offer to Iran to negotiate an agreement under the authority of the United Nations, but was turned down. Saddam Hussein suggested another 1-month truce to mark the beginning of Ramadan, but the Iranian mullahs disdainfully rejected it. Abdul Rahman Qasem Luhad, a former Iraqi leader, made the mistake of combining static defense and mobile guerrilla warfare to protect his bases. The PDKI, a Kurdish militia, was isolated and pushed back against the Iraqi border, fighting for its survival. The Iranian regime aimed to exploit its advantage by launching the Dawn 2 offense in the direction of Rawanduz Valley in North Iraqi Kurdistan. On July 22, Iraqi troops crossed the Piranshar Pass and overran the infantry brigade guarding it. They penetrated into Iraqi territory, seizing Omran, Rayat, and Mount Kermit. Saddam Hussein and Adnan Khairallah, the Minister of Defense, launched a forceful counterattack with massive air force support. After 3 days of bitter combat, Adnan Khairallah stabilized the front and ordered the construction of defenses and trenches identical to those protecting the rest of the front. The Iranians retained control of Omran and 10 other villages and entrusted their administration to the Shiites of the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution in Iraq. On July 30, 1983, the Iranians launched the Dawn 3 offensive, attacking in the center on a wide front stretching about 60 miles from Mehran to Deloran. The Iraqis detected the Iranian preparations and took the initiative of operations. Iranian commandos infiltrated Iraqi lines and took control of Iraqi outposts. On August 2nd, Iraqi infantrymen abandoned their trenches to re-establish their positions 3 miles away, inside Iraqi territory. General Sultan Ahmad counterattacked with his remaining tanks but succeeded thanks to massive Air Force intervention and the arrival of the 12th Armored Division. The Iraqis realized they would not be able to breach Iraqi lines or reach the Tigris. On August 10th, the Dawn 3 offensive in Iraq ended with mixed results. The Iranian army had successfully driven the Iraqis out of the Mehran-Deloran road, recapturing a narrow strip of land and pushing them back a few miles. However, the Iranians were believed to have sustained 7,000 dead and 15,000 wounded. The Iraqis took revenge by firing more salvos of Scud missiles at Iranian cities, while the Iranians retaliated by shelling Basra with their long-range artillery. The United Nations Security Council adopted a resolution demanding an immediate end to military operations and bombings directed at civilian populations, which Baghdad accepted. In early fall, the center of gravity of operations shifted back to Iran Kurdistan, where the Iranians launched the Dawn 4 offensive in the Marivan sector. The objective was to seize the Penjwan Valley, which was used as a supply route for weapons and ammunition to the PDKI's last bastions. The Iraqi military high command, General Mahir Abdul Rashid, led a mobile battle, pinning the enemy in place and outflanking it. On November 6, 1983, the Iranian army launched another attack on Iraqi lines, taking control of Penjwan and the mountainous salient sticking into Iranian territory between Marivan and Baneh. General al-Rashid, from the same tribe as Saddam Hussein and Adnan Khairallah, dispatched 2 Republican Guard shock battalions with chemical weapons, marking the first Iraqi use of chemical weapons since the beginning of hostilities. Despite improving their positions, the Iranians had not succeeded in seriously weakening their adversary due to insufficient logistics, a lack of fire support, and a dearth of sophisticated weapons. The Iranian command failed to create the conditions for a strategic surprise that would have allowed the Iraqi army to breach the front and outflank its enemy.